at its darkest hour, when the gates of Bursa trembled with the weight of what was coming. Not the weight of armies, not the weight of siege engines or battering rams or the thunder of 10,000 hooves against frozen earth. No, it was something heavier than all of that combined. It was the weight of a decision. A single decision made inside a tent lit by two oil lamps, where two men sat across from each other like opposite edges of the same sword, each one sharp, each one deadly, each one waiting for the other to bleed first. Arhan Sahib sat without moving. That was the thing about him that his enemies could never understand and his allies could never fully explain. He did not fidget. He did not tap his fingers or shift in his seat or let his eyes wander to the entrance of the tent the way lesser men do when they are uncomfortable. He simply sat, still as a mountain, still as the moment before lightning. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet that is louder than shouting. He said, "My condition is not singular. It is not merely that you hand over Iznik to me. That alone would be insufficient. That alone would be an insult dressed as a concession. No, my condition is this. You will hand over Iznik, yes, but you will also hand over the former Shahanshah. Because that man, that hollow shell of what was once a ruler, he has lost the faculties of his mind. He is diminished. He is broken in ways that cannot be repaired by time or medicine or prayer. He is not fit to sit upon your throne. He is not fit to watch over your kingdom. He is not fit to breathe the same air as men who still carry purpose in their lungs." And then Arhin paused, just for a moment, just long enough to let those words settle into the ground like roots. He said, "I do not consider you my enemy the way I consider them my enemy. The Shahanshah who races toward his own death, those men, they are their own punishment. But you still have a choice. That is why I am speaking to you with words instead of steel." And across from him, Shahanshah did not flinch. That was also the thing about Shahanshah that made him dangerous. Not his armies, not his walls, not even his cruelty, though that was considerable. What made him dangerous was that he never flinched. He absorbed words the way stone absorbs rain, letting them run off without penetrating. And when he smiled, it was the smile of a man who has already decided that this conversation is nothing more than theater, and that the real performance is happening somewhere else entirely. He said, "If you are so eager to race toward death, then race. Race, race, and let us see who arrives there first." Then he leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped to something almost conversational, almost gentle, the way a serpent's movement is almost graceful before it strikes. He said, "Handing over Iznik without a war, that kind of negligence, that kind of weakness, only my grandfather was capable of it. And surrendering that foolish grandfather to you, that is a demand I cannot fulfill even if I wish to, because we have already lost our grandfather. He is gone. He is beyond your reach and beyond mine." The moment those words landed, the woman known as Asporça felt them like a blade entering her chest without warning. She had been standing to the side, composed, controlled, holding herself together with the discipline of someone who has learned that grief shown in front of enemies is a weapon handed to them freely. But this she had not been prepared for. Her father. Gone. Not taken. Not imprisoned. Gone. She turned her face away for a moment, and in that fraction of a second, something inside her cracked. Arhan noticed. He always noticed. He said nothing, but he noticed. It was Andronikos who answered her unspoken question, and he answered it the way cruel men answer questions they enjoy answering. He said he died his own death. He went of his own accord. And Asporça looked at him with eyes that had shifted from grief to something colder, something harder, and she said, "Liar." One word, flat as a blade. And Andronikos said, "I am not lying. If anything, I wanted him to die by my dagger. He was a traitor. He surrendered land to the enemy without a single arrow being fired, without a single sword being drawn. He gave away what was not his to give, and he did it with a smile, and I will not pretend to mourn him." Then the voice that cut through the tent was not Asporça's and not Arhan's. It was another voice, older, harder, carrying the specific kind of fury that belongs to men who have spent decades keeping their anger banked like coals under ash, waiting for the moment when they are finally permitted to let it burn openly. The voice said, "Whoever has taken the breath from my lungs, whoever looks upon my land with hunger, I will cut off their hands and throw them into the dust. Here is the field, here is the man. Whoever has courage, whoever has nerve, let them come before me in the field of war. Let them face me, not with words, not with negotiations, not with conditions and counter-conditions and diplomatic theatre, with steel, with blood, with the honest language that has existed since before men learned to speak." And with that, the negotiations ended. Not with an agreement, not with a handshake, not with the careful drafting of terms that both sides could carry home and claim as victory. They ended the way negotiations between men like this always end, when neither side is willing to be the one to yield. They ended with everyone walking in different directions, each man certain he had just heard the beginning of the other's destruction. Damir Khan moved with Shahanshah and Mahmud, and as they walked, Damir Khan raised his sword in a gesture that was half salute and half threat, and he said, "My soldiers will have taken Shandali by now. It will already be done." And Shahanshah said, "When that news reaches Urhan, he will be surprised. He will not expect it. God willing, that surprise will cost him something he cannot replace." They did not say which something. They did not need to. Men like these communicate in implications, in what is left unsaid, in the spaces between words where the real meaning lies. And on the other side of the same evening, Urhan Sahib turned to Asporça, and his voice changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to someone watching from a distance, but it changed. The iron went out of it, just slightly, and something more human came in to replace it, something that recognized her pain without making a performance of that recognition. He said, "Accept my condolences." And Asporça, who had been holding herself rigid since the moment she heard the news, finally let herself exhale. Just once. Just enough to say, "He is gone, Urhan. My father is gone, and I am alone now." And Urhan said, "Your life is my trust. You are not alone." She looked at him for a moment, this woman who had learned early in her life that trust is a currency more dangerous than gold because it can be counterfeited, and because the cost of discovering a counterfeit is always paid in pain. She looked at him, and she said, "I know." And then she turned and began to walk, and the others followed, and the night folded itself around all of them like a shroud. Inside the palace at Bursa, the world was a different kind of night entirely. Raj Khartan moved through the corridors with the specific energy of a woman who has organized 1,000 celebrations and intends this one to be the finest. Her voice carried ahead of her like a herald announcing the arrival of someone important. She was saying, "Quickly, quickly, evening is coming. We do not have the luxury of slowness tonight. Everything must be ready, every lamp lit, every surface polished, every flower in its proper place." Outside the main hall, half hidden in a shadow that she had chosen with the unconscious precision of someone accustomed to watching without being watched, Difne stood. She was watching the preparations the way she watched most things, with an expression that revealed nothing and absorbed everything. A woman passing with a child caught her attention momentarily, and Difne tracked them with her eyes, quietly, continuously, the way water finds the path of least resistance without announcing its intention. The woman with the child had come to ask for Malhoun Khartan. She had been asking since earlier in the evening, patient in the way that desperation makes people patient, because when you have no other options, persistence becomes your only currency. Iraj had already turned her away once with a coin pressed into her palm and the firm instruction to return another time. The palace was busy. The palace was preparing for a wedding. The palace did not have space in its attention for one woman and one child tonight. But the woman came back. She stood at the entrance again and said, "Please, please, I must see Malhoun Khartan. She listens to everyone. She is known for it. She takes away pain. My child needs her." And Asma, who had now also been drawn into the effort of redirecting this persistent visitor, said, "Every time I turn around, there you are. Subhan Allah, I have told you it is impossible. It cannot happen. Not tonight. Come back tomorrow. Come back next week. Come back when the celebration is finished and the palace has returned to its normal rhythm. But not tonight." And the woman looked at her child, and then she looked at the palace, and then she turned and walked away again. And Difne watched her go, and her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted very slightly, like a door opening a fraction of an inch in a wall that was supposed to have no doors. In the forest, the night air was cool against Fatima's face as she rode. She had slipped away from the palace preparations with the practiced ease of someone who has learned to move between worlds without leaving footprints in either. She found Evronos where she expected to find him, standing with his horse in the place that had become theirs without either of them formally declaring it as such. The place exists before the name for it does. The belonging comes before the language to describe it. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with something in his eyes that he had never been able to fully contain or conceal, something that ran too deep for the kind of careful management that public life requires. And he said, "Welcome, my dear Fatima, my beloved Fatima." She slid from her horse and said, "We are doing the henna ceremony tonight. Why did you call me here? I barely escaped my mother's attention. You know how she watches everything." He said, "Tomorrow we will be married. We will become one. Two people becoming one thing, one life, one future made from two separate pasts. I made a promise to Fatima Khatun, and I called you here because of that promise." She tilted her head and said, "Really?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "What was the promise?" He said, "We run like horses without reins, without thinking, without calculating, without the weight of all the things that will come afterward. Just for this moment, we run." And he mounted his horse, and she mounted hers, and they rode. They rode the way people ride when they are briefly, genuinely free of everything, when the wind takes the weight off their shoulders, and the speed makes the future temporarily impossible to see. They rode until the forest thinned and the path opened, and the night stretched around them like a gift. And then they slowed, and they came back to where they had started, and they stood close to each other in the quiet. Fatima said, "I feel like I am dreaming. I'm afraid the dream will break." Evronos said, "This is not a dream. This is the most beautiful truth in the world, and tomorrow we will make it permanent." She reached into the small cloth she carried and withdrew something carefully, the way you withdraw something you have been carrying for years and only now feel ready to release. She held it out to him. A ring. Small, worn, smooth in the places where her father's fingers had held it most often, polished by decades of use until it carried his warmth in its metal. She said, "This is my father's archery ring. He taught me to shoot. The day I hit my first real target, he placed this ring in my hand. He said to give it to the man into whose hands I would place my heart." Evronos looked at the ring for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at her. She said, "Today I give you my heart, and I give you my most precious trust. Take it, keep it. Do not let it become something I regret giving." He took the ring and he said, "This trust is now mine. And I make this vow, I will not remove it for as long as I live, not for comfort, not for convenience, not for any reason that is smaller than death." She smiled, and for a moment the whole forest seemed to soften around her. Then she said, "I must go back before my mother notices. You know how she is. She has eyes in the back of her head and possibly in the sides as well." He laughed, quiet and genuine, and said, "You will leave and I will remain here holding this ring and missing you before you are even out of sight." She mounted her horse, and she looked at him once more, and then she rode back through the trees toward the lights of the palace, toward the henna ceremony, toward all the women who were waiting to surround her with songs and blessings, and the organized celebration of a love that most of them had watched develop from a distance with varying degrees of approval and emotion. Evronos watched her go, then looked down at the ring in his palm. He stayed there for a long time. Inside the palace, Malhoun Khatun was orchestrating the henna ceremony with the calm authority of a woman who understands that celebrations require the same level of strategic management as military operations, and that the consequences of failure are, in their own way, equally significant. Asporça sat to one side. She had composed herself entirely by now, assembled herself back into the version of herself that the world was permitted to see. But the grief sat in her like a stone in still water, invisible from the surface, permanent at the bottom. The women who carried the henna came through the doorway singing. Their voices filled the corridor and the room beyond it with something warm, something that smelled of rose water and celebration, and the particular kind of joy that belongs specifically to the night before a wedding, when everything is still possibility and nothing has yet become memory. They sang about the bride whose hair is like a crown. They sang about the bride whose face is like an angel's. They sang about the henna being blessed, about the prayers being answered, about the joy that was coming. And they moved around Fatima in a circle, and she sat in the center of that circle with her hands folded in her lap and tears running quietly down her face. Iraj stepped forward and lifted the cloth that covered Fatima's face, and she saw the tears, and she said, "Yes, she has cried, as it should be." And she called to Malhoun and said, "Come forward, come and see." Malhoun came. She knelt beside Fatima and opened her hands, and then Gonya said, "Wait, wait, mother, the ritual must be observed. You know the rule. The bride does not open her hand until the groom's family has offered something first. Fatima, close your hand tightly. Do not open it. You know the tradition." Malhoun straightened slightly and said, "Is there something from the groom's family?" Gonya said to the room, "The bride does not open her hand, ladies, not until the offering has been made." And then Nilüfer stepped forward and began to say, "If there is nothing from the groom's family, then—" But she did not finish, because Asporça was already moving. She moved forward with the particular decisiveness of someone who has been waiting for this moment, waiting for a moment when she could place her grief somewhere useful, translate her pain into action. And she said, "There is something from the groom's family," and from the small pouch she carried, she withdrew a flower and 2 coins, and she placed them in Malhoun's hands. Malhoun looked at the coins and at the flower, and then she turned to Fatima, and she opened Fatima's hands, both of them, one after the other, and applied the henna in careful patterns, pressing the coins into the paste so that they were held there by the color and the warmth, and wrapped them in cloth to keep the design while it set, and placed the flower in Fatima's palm above the cloth. Then she lifted the veil from Fatima's face completely, and Fatima rose, and she took her mother's hand in both of hers, and she kissed it. Not a formal gesture, not a performance, a genuine one. Malhoun said, "Come here, my beautiful daughter. May God preserve your joy. May he keep your happiness alive and undiminished. May everything you have hoped for arrive in its proper season." She embraced her daughter, and for a moment the room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something genuinely tender happens inside them, when everyone present instinctively understands that they are witnessing something that does not need to be commented upon or embellished or explained. Then Fatima turned to Asporça and took her hands and said, "I heard about your father. I am so sorry, deeply sorry. Please accept my condolences. Please know that your grief matters in this house." Asporça said, "Thank you," and her voice was steady, and she met Fatima's eyes, and something passed between them that was not exactly friendship, but was the territory just before it, the mutual recognition of 2 women who carry weight and carry it without complaint. Then Fatima moved through the room, embracing Gonya, embracing Nilüfer, receiving the good wishes of all the women who had gathered, and the singing resumed, and the henna dried in its patterns, and the night deepened. Outside the palace walls, the woman with the child had returned for the 3rd time. This persistence was not stubbornness. It was not obstinacy. It was something far simpler and far more painful. It was necessity. The kind of necessity that does not understand the word later. The kind of necessity that stands outside closed doors in the dark because there is nowhere else to go and no one else to ask and no choice remaining except to keep standing and keep asking until someone finally says yes. This time it was Asma who came to the door, and Asma looked at this woman with an expression that had moved beyond frustration into something closer to resigned bewilderment, and said, "Subhan Allah, you again. How many times have I told you? How many times do I have to say the same words before they reach you? This is not possible tonight. It is not possible. Go home. Rest. Come back when the celebration is finished." The woman looked at her daughter. Then she looked at the palace. Then she turned and walked away again, back into the dark, back into whatever situation had driven her here in the first place, carrying her child and her unanswered need back into the night. And from her shadow, Difner watched her go, and this time the thing behind her eyes was not just a door opening. It was a question forming, and questions, in Difner's experience, had a way of requiring answers. It was at this same moment, while the henna was still setting, and the songs were still being sung, and the woman with the child was disappearing back into the darkness of the city, that Mahmud appeared at the palace gates with soldiers flanking him. Mustafa came forward and greeted him, and Mahmud said, "I am glad to see you. I have something I must discuss with Urhan Saheb. There is information, there are developments, there are things that cannot wait until morning." Mustafa said nothing. He simply turned and led Mahmud inside, through the corridors of the palace, where the celebration sounds drifted from the interior rooms, past the guards who stood at intervals along the walls like statues that breathe, and toward the chamber where Urhan Saheb would be found. And this is where the palace held its breath. Because Mahmud was not simply a messenger. Mahmud carried something with him that was heavier than news and more dangerous than a weapon. He carried the knowledge of what Damir Khan's forces had done at Shandali. He carried the knowledge that while Urhan had been sitting across a negotiation table speaking words of justice and condition and measured ultimatum, the other side had already moved, had already acted, had already taken ground. This is the nature of war when your enemy has decided that words are theatre. They speak to you with their mouths and move against you with everything else. Urhan Saheb would hear this news, and he would not react the way lesser commanders react, with fury that consumes judgment, with the kind of anger that makes men ride into darkness without calculating what waits for them there. No, Urhan Saheb would go still. He would become even more still than his usual stillness, and in that stillness he would make decisions that would echo for years. The night was not finished with any of them. Not with Asporça, who sat in a room full of celebration, carrying a grief that was too fresh to have found its shape yet, a grief that would need weeks or months to settle into something she could carry without it threatening to drop her. Not with Fatima, whose henna-covered hands held the memory of her father's ring and the promise of her future, both of them present simultaneously, the way joy and loss are always simultaneously present in moments of major transition. Not with Evronos, who stood alone in the forest long after she had gone, holding a ring that was both a weight and a gift, turning it in his fingers in the dark. Not with the woman and the child, moving back through the streets of Bursa with nowhere to go and no one to help them, not yet. Not with Difner, who had seen too much and said too little, and was assembling what she had observed into something that she had not yet decided what to do with. Not with Damir Khan, who rode through the night toward Shandali with the specific confidence of a man who believes he has already won something significant, without yet understanding that what he has won may not be what he thinks it is. Not with Shahanshah, who lay in his chambers constructing the architecture of a plan that rested on the assumption that Urhan Saheb was predictable, and that assumption was his greatest mistake, his most fundamental misreading of the man, because Urhan Saheb was many things, but predictable was never among them. Let us now go back further. Let us go back to the hours before the negotiation to understand the ground upon which this evening was built. Turhan had spent the morning doing what Turhan always did in the hours before a significant encounter. He moved. He circled the perimeter of wherever Urhan Saheb intended to be, not in an obvious way, not in the way of a guard who wants to be seen being vigilant, but in the quiet, continuous, unhurried way of a man who is simply part of the landscape until the moment he needs to not be part of the landscape. Turhan had a quality that was difficult to describe to people who had never seen him work. He was, on the surface, simply a swordsman. A very good swordsman, certainly, among the finest in the region, with a particular talent for the kind of reflexive interception that requires the body to move before the mind has fully processed the threat. There are moments in combat when there is no time for the conscious mind to issue instructions. The hand must know what to do before the brain has finished deciding. Turhan's hand always knew. He had pulled arrows out of the air 3 times in the past year, not from a standing position, not from a prepared stance, but in motion, mid-stride, in the chaos of a moment where most men would have flinched and most commanders would have fallen. Each time, the arrow had been intended for Arhan Sahib, and each time, Tarhan had simply been in the right position, which was always the position between Arhan and whatever was flying toward him. On this particular morning, Tarhan had walked the long way around to the site of the negotiation, stopping twice to speak with soldiers he trusted about the sight lines from the surrounding trees, about the distance to the nearest stable where horses could be brought quickly if departure became necessary, about the position of Andro Nikos's personal guards, and what angle they would move from if things deteriorated beyond speech. He had spoken to Burhan Faladios also, briefly, in the blunt shorthand that soldiers who have fought alongside each other develop over years of shared danger. Faladios was a man who expressed things simply. He did not traffic in implication or metaphor. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. And what he said on this particular morning was that he did not trust the negotiation, and he did not trust Andronikos, and he specifically did not trust the arrangement of Shahanshah's forces at the edge of the treeline to the east, which was not quite where you would put forces if you were genuinely committed to the idea of peaceful negotiation. Tarhan said, "Noted." Falladio said, "That is all. Noted." Tarhan said, "What else would you like me to say?" Falladio said, "I would like you to say that we have a contingency, a real one, not a theoretical one." Tarhan looked at him for a moment, then said, "We always have a contingency. You know that." Falladio said, "Yes. I also know that the contingency depends on how quickly you can get from where you are to where you need to be, and that gap is currently larger than I am comfortable with." Tarhan said, "Then reduce your discomfort." Falladios made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a curse, and walked away, and Tarhan watched him go with something that might have been appreciation, because Falladios, for all his bluntness, for all the rough edges that had made him a difficult person to manage in administrative contexts, was never wrong about distances. He had an instinct for space, for the gap between where safety ended and danger began, that Tarhan had come to trust the way he trusted very few things. It was Falladios who, years earlier, had identified Yakid as a problem before Yakid had become one. Not with evidence, not with documents or testimony or the kind of formal accusation that requires a hearing. Simply with the instinct of a man who has learned to read other men the way navigators read weather, by the subtle shifts that precede the storm. He had gone to Arhan Sahib and said that man is going to betray us. Not might, not could, is going to. And Arhan had listened, the way he always listened, without interrupting, without signaling agreement or dismissal, simply receiving the words and placing them somewhere inside himself where they could be retrieved later if they proved relevant. They proved relevant. Yakid's betrayal, when it came in the way betrayals always come from men who are not dramatic by nature, quietly, practically, with the specific logic of someone who has decided that loyalty is a luxury he can no longer afford. He did not make speeches. He did not reveal himself with anger or with the kind of confrontation that at least carries the dignity of honesty. He simply redirected information. He allowed certain things to flow in directions they were not supposed to flow. He was, for a period of time, a crack in a wall so small that only someone actively looking for cracks would find it. Falladios found it. And the question of what to do with Yakid had occupied a significant portion of the deliberations between Arhan, Tarhan, Falladios, and the senior commanders who needed to know. Zarkan had argued for immediate action. Kulads had argued for patience, for allowing the situation to develop until its full shape was visible. Killil had said almost nothing, which in his case was significant because Killil only went silent when he was already in motion internally, already working through a plan that he did not yet want to share. Al-Aliaddin Sahib had said that the question was not what to do with Yakid specifically, but what to do about the system that had produced Yakid, the environment that made betrayal seem rational, the conditions under which a man could calculate that the cost of loyalty exceeded the cost of treachery. Altadin Saheb had agreed, and had then spent 40 minutes explaining why he agreed in more detail than the situation strictly required, which was characteristic of him, and which everyone present had learned to account for by simply waiting. Jakarta Saheb had said almost exactly what Faladios had said, but in more words and with more examples, and Faladios had listened to this with the expression of a man watching someone reconstruct something he built from the original blueprints without acknowledging they exist. Tamia Boga had said nothing for a long time and then said, "When the time comes, I will handle it." No one asked what he meant. Everyone understood what he meant. Abdul Rahman had said, "Let us be certain before we act. Let us be absolutely certain, because the cost of certainty is time, and the cost of acting without certainty is justice." And Arhan Saheb had sat through all of this, receiving all of it, and when everyone had finished speaking, he had said, "We will be certain, and then we will act. And then we will not speak of it again, because men who need to revisit their decisions are men who were not certain when they made them." The certainty came, and the action followed. And Yakid, who had calculated that the cost of loyalty exceeded the cost of treachery, discovered in the final hours of his life that the calculation he had made was wrong, not in the mathematics of it, perhaps, but in the fundamental premise, because he had treated loyalty as though it were a commodity with a market price, something to be bought and sold based on current conditions, and he had failed to understand that for the men around Arhan Saheb, loyalty was not a commodity. It was a covenant, and the breaking of a covenant is not merely a financial error, it is a moral one. And moral errors in this world, in this time, in the lives of these men, carry a specific and non-negotiable price. Yakid paid it. He paid it on a morning that was unremarkable in every other respect, a morning where the birds were making the sounds birds make, and the light was doing what light does, and the world had not yet been informed that something significant was about to happen inside it. He paid it with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of arguments, who has reached the end of the chain of rationalizations that had sustained him, and who finds at the end of that chain not freedom, but the wall he had been building toward all along. Faladios was there. He stood a few steps away, not gloating, because Faladios was not a man who gloated, gloating being a waste of energy that could be directed elsewhere, but present, witnessing, because witnessing matters, because the presence of someone who knew, someone who had named the thing before it fully became the thing, carries a weight of its own in these moments, not the weight of "I told you so," which is small and petty, the weight of recognition. The weight of saying, with his presence, that this consequence belongs to the choice that produced it. Tamia Boga had been there also, and Mahmud, and Zarkan, standing at the edge of the group with his arms folded, watching the way he watched everything, with the specific kind of attention that stores what it sees without immediately interpreting it, that files it away for future use in contexts that have not yet arrived. Turhan had not been there. Turhan was with Arhan. He was always with Arhan. Arhan Saheb himself had not watched. He had received the report afterward, sitting exactly the way he sat during the negotiation, without moving, without flinching, with the particular quality of stillness that was not coldness, but was something more complicated, the stillness of a man who has made peace with the full weight of the decisions he is required to make, who carries that weight not lightly but continuously, without setting it down. He had received the report and said, "May God have mercy on the soul that knew better and chose worse." That was all. The men around him had understood that this was not a callous statement. It was a prayer, a genuine one. And it was also a warning, not directed at them, directed at the understanding itself, the understanding that knowing better and choosing worse is the specific failure that Arhan Saheb finds least forgivable, because it is the one that cannot be explained by ignorance or circumstance. It can only be explained by will. And will is the one thing a man has that belongs entirely to him, the one thing no one else can take from him, which means it is the one thing for which he bears complete and absolute responsibility. Now, returning to the tent, returning to the negotiation that had just ended without an agreement, returning to the night that was now well and truly underway. Arhen Saheb walked back toward the palace, with Turhan 2 steps behind him on the left, and Mustafa 2 steps behind him on the right, and the soldiers who had accompanied him to the negotiation site forming a loose perimeter around all of them, not tightly, not in a way that would signal nervousness, but in the quiet, confident way of men who are simply doing what they are supposed to do. Arhen's mind, during this walk, was moving in a way that his face did not reveal. He was already in the next conversation, the one that would happen when he arrived back at the palace. He was already assembling the pieces of what he knew and what he suspected, and what Mahmud had come to tell him, and what that told him about what had happened at Shandali, and what that meant for the shape of the next several days. War is not primarily a physical activity. That is the misunderstanding that destroys commanders who have physical courage, but not the other kind. War is primarily a thinking activity, and the physical part is the expression of whoever thought better. Arhen Saheb was not the largest man in his army, or the fastest, or the one who could hold a sword longest without tiring. He was the one who could see further into the consequences of each decision, who could hold more variables in his mind simultaneously without losing the thread, who could remain calm in conditions that produce panic in everyone around him, and that calmness was not indifference. It was discipline, decades of practiced discipline. He thought about Shandali. He thought about Damir Khan, who was competent in the way of a man who has never been tested by something genuinely outside his competence, who mistakes the absence of defeat for the presence of mastery. He thought about what Damir Khan would do after taking Shandali, which was almost certainly not what Shahanshah expected him to do, because Damir Khan was the kind of soldier who wins a position and then stops moving, who treats the achievement of the objective as the end point rather than as one step in a continuing sequence. He thought about Andronikos, who was more dangerous than Damir Khan because he was more imaginative. Andronikos would not stop moving after taking an objective. Andronikos would be already thinking about the next thing. He would be thinking about how the taking of Shandali could be leveraged, what it opened, what it forced Arhen to choose between, how it rearranged the board. He thought about what it meant that Shahanshah had spoken of his grandfather in the past tense. The former Shahanshah was gone, truly gone. This changed things. Not dramatically, not in the way that battlefield events change things, but in the subtle way that the removal of a piece from the board changes the geometry of everything that remains. The former Shahanshah had been a weight, but he had also been a point of possible negotiation, a possible concession, a possible bridge. That bridge was gone now. And the question was whether Shahanshah understood the implications of that, whether he recognized that in the removal of a possible concession, he had also removed a possible protection. Because Arhan Saheb had offered him something in that tent, not explicitly, not in language that could be quoted back, but in the architecture of his opening statement, in the specific formulation of his conditions, he had offered Shahanshah a version of this situation that had an exit, a difficult exit, a humiliating exit perhaps by some measures, but an exit nonetheless. And Shahanshah had looked at that exit and said, "Race toward death if you wish to race." Which meant there was no longer any exit to offer, which meant the next conversation would not be held with words. Turhan read this from the quality of Arhan's silence. He did not need to ask. He never needed to ask. He simply adjusted his stride very slightly, a fraction of an inch, the weight shifting forward rather than back, the body preparing itself for what the mind had already understood. Mustafa also read it, though he read it differently, with more words internally, more conscious processing. He began running through the logistics in his head, supply lines, positions, which captains were in which locations, how long it would take to get a message to Abdul Rahman, who was the furthest out, how quickly Tamir Boga could be ready, which was always quickly, because Tamir Boga existed in a state of continuous readiness that some people found disturbing and that Mustafa found reassuring. They reached the palace. Mahmud was waiting. The conversation that followed was conducted in low voices in a room where a single lamp burned in the corner, and the shadows pressed against the walls. and the sound of the women singing from the celebration carried faintly through the stone, the melody muffled but present, the joy of one part of this world insisting on being audible even to the part that was occupied with entirely different concerns. Mahmud laid out what he knew. Shandali had fallen. The soldiers of Damir Khan had moved in the night, earlier than anyone expected, using a route that suggested someone had provided information about the watch rotations. This was not a lucky guess. This was intelligence. Someone had talked. Someone had, in the tradition of those who come before people like Yakid and do not learn from their predecessors' endings, decided that information was something they could afford to sell. Arhen listened to all of this without interrupting. When Mahmud finished, Arhen was quiet for a moment, and in that moment the singing from the celebration floated through the stone again, clearer this time, a phrase of the melody that sounded almost deliberate, almost like a comment. Then Arhen said, who knew the rotation at Shandali. Mahmud named 5 people. Arhen said, find out which of those 5 told Damir Khan. Take the time you need. Be certain before you come back to me. Mahmud said, and then. Arhen said, and then come back to me. Mahmud left. Tarhin remained. And in the silence that followed, Arhen Sahib did something that he rarely did in the presence of anyone, even Tarhin. He stood by the window and looked out at the city, at the lights that burned in the houses, at the dark spaces between the lights, at the sky above everything, vast and indifferent and full of stars that had been burning before any of these men were born, and would continue burning long after all of them were gone. He said quietly, not to Tarhan specifically, more to the room, to the air, to whatever listens to the things that commanders say when they are not performing command, he said, every decision I make costs something. Every one. Even the right ones. Even the ones that are clearly right, that have no defensible alternative. They all cost something. The question is never whether to pay. The question is always what you are paying for. Tarhan said nothing. He had learned, over years of standing beside this man, that some statements are not addressed to anyone and do not require response. They are simply truth being released into the air, being allowed to exist outside the person who has been carrying it. After a while, Arhin turned from the window and said, tomorrow we begin. Tarhan said, yes. And that was the entirety of the strategic conversation that determined the direction of what would happen next. Men who have worked together long enough do not need elaborate language. The entire plan lived in those 4 words and their confirmation. Tomorrow we begin. Yes, everything else was implementation. Implementation was what the commanders were for. Implementation was Faladios's domain, and Zarkan's, and Tamir Boga's, and Abdul Rahman's, and Killal's, and the rest of them, each one responsible for his specific piece. Each piece fitting against the others the way stones in a well-built wall fit. No gap, no weakness, the whole structure stronger than any individual component. But before any of that could begin, the night had to finish. And the night still had things left in it. Asporça sat in her room alone for the first time since the negotiation had ended. The palace around her was full of sound, the celebration continuing, the singing still going, the particular warmth of a gathering that refuses to acknowledge the cold. But her room was quiet, and in that quiet she allowed herself what she had not allowed herself in the tent, in front of Andronikos, in front of Shahanshah, in front of anyone. She grieved. Not dramatically, not with the kind of visible anguish that is also, whether intended or not, a kind of performance. Quietly, in the way that people who are accustomed to carrying things alone carry things alone. She sat on the edge of her bed, and she held in her mind the image of her father as he had been, not as the diminished figure that Andronikos had described, not the broken man that Shahanshah had characterized as already lost, but as he had been before all of that, as she had known him. The way he moved, the specific sound of his voice when he was in a good mood, which was different from his voice in all other moods, in a way that she could never quite describe, but always immediately recognized. The specific things he said when he was trying to tell her something important without quite admitting that he was trying to tell her something important. The way he had always, regardless of everything else, regardless of whatever pressures he was under or whatever had gone wrong, made her feel that she was not alone. And now she was. Or that was what she had said to Urhin. I am alone now. And Urhin had said, you are not alone. She sat with that for a long time. The word of a man who has never yet said something he did not mean in her experience. Not precisely warm words, not the comfort that a father gives, not the specific quality of presence that she had lost, but something real and durable and not dependent on favorable conditions to remain true. She was not alone. The night deepened. In the city, the woman with the child had found shelter. Not the shelter she had come to the palace seeking, not the specific help that only Malhoun Khartoum could provide, but shelter of the basic kind, a doorway, a corner out of the wind, the specific accommodation that the city offers to those who cannot afford anything better. The child slept with her head against her mother's shoulder, the deep, untroubled sleep of children who do not yet fully understand their circumstances, whose bodies simply demand rest regardless of what the mind is dealing with. The mother did not sleep. She sat with her back against the stone and her arms around her child, and she watched the dark street, and she waited for morning, because morning was all she had, and morning was also all she needed. In the morning, she would try again. In the morning, the celebration would be finished, and the palace would return to its normal rhythms, and she would go back, and this time she would not accept being turned away, because the morning version of her would have had all night to become more certain that she had no other choice. Difne, returning to her own quarters through a back passage that she preferred, because it gave her 3 more seconds of warning if anyone was approaching from the main corridor, turned over in her mind what she had seen. The woman. The child, the repeated attempts, the persistence that had a specific quality to it, not the persistence of someone making a complaint or pursuing a preference, but the persistence of someone in genuine extremity. She filed this. She would do something with it. Not tonight. Tonight was not the right moment, but soon. She had learned that the right moment for things rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives quietly, the way all important things arrive, and the skill is in recognizing it before it has already passed. Evronos had returned to Bursa well before the henna ceremony ended. He arrived at the palace from the side entrance that the senior commanders used, and he was greeted by 2 of his men who gave him the evening's reports, and he listened to them while simultaneously thinking about a ring in his hand and a woman riding through trees, and the specific way the moonlight had caught her face at the moment. She gave him the ring and said, I place my heart in your hands. He would sleep well that night, which would surprise him slightly when he woke the next morning and realized it, because he was accustomed to sleeping the way soldiers sleep, lightly, with one part of the mind always listening. But that night he slept deeply, and when he woke, the ring was on his finger, and the morning was just beginning its approach over the hills east of Bursa, and the day that awaited him was the most significant day of his life in the categories that have nothing to do with war. His wedding day. He lay in the dark for a few minutes just before dawn and listened to the silence of the palace, and it seemed to him that even the silence sounded different this morning, that it had a quality to it that ordinary silences do not possess, as though the ordinary silence had been given something to anticipate and was holding that anticipation in the way only silence can hold things completely, without leakage. Tarhen, who did not sleep at all that night, as was his habit before days of significance, sat in the small room adjacent to Arhan Sahib's quarters and sharpened his sword. Not because it needed sharpening. It was already sharp. It was always already sharp. But the act of sharpening is also an act of preparation, a way of telling the body that tomorrow is different from today, a way of converting the restless energy of anticipation into something precise and purposeful and contained. He thought about Palladios, and whether Palladios had gotten any sleep, which he doubted, not because Palladios suffered from the kind of sleeplessness that is driven by anxiety, but because Palladios in the days before action was driven by the same restlessness that Tarhan was driven by, the inability to fully occupy the present when the future was already pulling. He thought about Damir Khan at Shandali and what Damir Khan's next move would be. And he thought about it the way Arhan had taught all of them to think about enemy movements, not from your own perspective, not from the perspective of what you would do in his position, but from his perspective, from what he knows, what he believes, what he is afraid of, what he wants, what he thinks is available to him. You cannot predict an enemy by knowing yourself. You can only predict an enemy by knowing him. Damir Khan knew two things with certainty. He knew that he had taken Shandali, and he knew that Arhan Sahib now knew that he had taken Shandali. Everything else, the timing of Arhan's response, the direction of it, the forces available to Arhan, the state of Arhan's alliances, was uncertain from Damir Khan's position, which meant Damir Khan was operating in a space of strategic uncertainty, and men who operate in that space have a tendency toward one of two responses. Either they fortify and wait, consolidating what they have taken, or they push forward again, trying to create additional facts before the response arrives. Tarhan thought Damir Khan would fortify. He was that kind of soldier. He thought about whether that assessment would change anything in the plan that he and Arhan had arrived at in their forward exchange at the window. He decided it did not, because the plan did not depend on Damir Khan moving. It depended on Arhan Sahib moving, and Arhan Sahib moved on his own terms, not in response to what his enemy did, but in pursuit of what he had already decided to pursue. This was the difference that separated them. Damir Khan was reactive. He was excellent at reacting. But Arhan Sahib did not react. He initiated. And the side that initiates, the side that determines the shape and timing and location of the confrontation, holds the advantage even before the first contact is made. The sword was already sharp. Tarhan kept sharpening it. And outside, the last hours of the night moved in their patient, inexorable way toward morning. The stars that Arhan had looked at from his window continued their vast, indifferent burning. The city continued its sleep. The guards at the palace gates continued their vigilance, two at each gate, the rhythm of their rounds as regular as breathing. Somewhere in the direction of Shandali, fires burned that had not been burning the previous night. The fires of an occupying force settling in for whatever came next. And in the morning, what would come next would begin. This is what it meant to live in these times. This is what it meant to be any of these people. Arhan Sahib with his impossible stillness and his honest prayers and his clear-eyed understanding of what each decision costs. Tarhan with his sword and his reflexes and his chosen vigil. Faladios with his blunt assessments and his unfailing spatial instinct. Asporça with her grief and her composure and her willingness to trust a word. Fatima with her father's ring and her mother's embrace and the henna drying in patterns on her hands. Evronos with his unexpected gift of deep sleep on the night before everything changed. The unnamed woman in the doorway with her sleeping child and her determination and her morning still ahead of her. Difner in her passage watching and filing and waiting for the right moment. All of them living inside the same night. All of them occupying different rooms within it. All of them moving toward the same morning that would arrive at exactly the same time for all of them, regardless of their preparation, regardless of their readiness, regardless of whether they had slept or prayed or sharpened their sword or simply sat in a doorway and waited. The morning comes for everyone. The question, as it has always been the question in lives lived at this intensity, in this proximity to the edges of things, is who you are when it arrives. Arhan Sahib had answered that question for himself long before this particular night. He had answered it in 100 smaller moments that were also, in their way, the same question in different clothing. He answered it the same way every time, not with a declaration, not with a speech, with the quality of his attention, with the nature of his stillness, with the words he chose and the ones he did not, with the prayers he offered and meant, with the trust he extended and then kept. And tomorrow, in the field that Damir Khan's fires had already begun to define, he would answer it again, in the way that only the field can confirm. This night, these people, this city, this story, it does not end here. It continues into morning and into the days that follow morning and into the seasons that carry those days into something larger. into the long arc of a world being made, contested, lost, and remade. But this particular piece of it, this gathering of specific souls in a specific darkness, the negotiation that ended without agreement, the henna that dried in its patterns, the ring that passed from a daughter's hand to a future husband's finger, the soldier who sharpened an already sharp sword, the woman in the doorway, the grief in the quiet room, the plan contained in 4 words and their confirmation, this piece belongs to this night. And this night is coming to its close. Not with resolution, not with the tied-up endings that do not exist in real life, in real war, in real grief, in real love, but with the particular kind of suspension that comes at the edge of sleep and the edge of morning, when the darkness is at its deepest, and the light has not yet begun, but you know, in the way that people who have lived through enough transitions know, that it is coming. It is always coming. The night holds you for a moment longer, and then it releases you into the morning. And in the morning, everything continues. May the merciful keep those who sleep in this city. May the just find their way to the decisions that deserve to be made. May the grief find its shape and become something that can be carried without destroying the one who carries it. May the joy of a wedding morning arrive clean and uncomplicated, at least for those hours, at least for that much. May the woman in the doorway find her way to the help she is seeking. May the ring stay on the finger that now holds it. May the plan that lives in 4 words prove as solid in the morning light as it seemed in the lamplit dark. And may the men who race toward their own destruction, as Arhan Sahib observed they were doing, arrive there by their own choices, cleanly, without taking innocent things with them on the way. This is the story of Arhan Sahib and the night that preceded the morning that changed everything. It is not finished, but this part of it is. The morning arrived the way mornings arrive after nights like that one. Not gently, not with the kind of gradual illumination that gives you time to adjust, but with a hard, clean line of light that cut across the eastern hills and divided the world into what had happened and what was about to happen, with no space between them for hesitation or second thoughts or the luxury of wishing things were different. Arhan Sahib was already standing when the light reached his window. He had not slept. Not because he could not sleep. He had trained himself years ago to sleep in any conditions, in any position, for any duration that circumstances permitted, but because this particular night had not been a night for sleeping. It had been a night for holding the full weight of what was coming and examining it from every angle, and then setting it down, not because it had become lighter, but because he had become certain. Certainty is not the absence of doubt. Arhan Sahib had learned this distinction early, from men who understood it, and he had carried that understanding through every campaign and every negotiation and every decision that had brought him to this particular morning, in this particular room, looking out at this particular city. Certainty is the decision to act despite doubt. It is the moment when you stop asking whether this is the right thing and start asking how to do it correctly, because the time for the first question has passed, and the time for the second has arrived, and the distance between those 2 questions is the distance between a man who thinks and a man who leads. He turned from the window and dressed in the way he always dressed on days of consequence, deliberately, each piece of clothing considered, each fastening completed with the same attention he would give to the placement of soldiers on a field. The outer coat was dark, almost black, heavy enough to carry weight, but not so heavy as to restrict movement. The belt sat exactly where it always sat, snug against the hip, holding the scabbard at the angle that allowed the fastest draw. The boots had been cleaned the previous evening by someone whose name Arhan knew and whose work Arhan respected, because respect for the people who maintain the things you depend on is not generosity but justice. Tarhin was waiting outside the door. He had been waiting there since before the light arrived, standing in the corridor with his back against the stone and his sword at his side and his eyes open, watching the far end of the hallway where the corridor turned toward the main hall, watching it the way he watched everything, not with suspicion, but with a continuous attention that does not distinguish between threat and non-threat, that simply observes everything and lets the mind sort what matters from what does not. When the door opened, Turhan straightened. He did not salute. He did not offer a greeting. He simply fell into step, 2 paces behind and to the left, and they walked. The palace at this hour was a different thing than the palace at any other hour. The celebration from the previous night had left traces everywhere, the faint smell of rosewater and henna, a forgotten ribbon on the floor of the corridor near the women's quarters, the particular quality of stillness that follows a night of sustained activity, like the silence after music, which is not the same silence as the silence before it. Before music, silence is empty. After music, silence is full. They passed through the main corridor and into the council room, where Mustafa was already present, standing near the long table with maps spread across its surface, weighted at the corners with stones that had been used for this purpose so many times that their surfaces had been worn smooth by the edges of the parchment. Mustafa looked up when they entered and said, "Faladios is on his way. Zarkan sent word at first light that he is in position. Abdul Rahman confirms he received the message last night and will be ready by midday. Tamir Boga has been ready since before any of us woke up, which surprises no one." Arhin said, "Killil." Mustafa said, "No word from Killil yet." Arhan said, "That means he is already moving." Mustafa paused, considered this, and then nodded slowly because it was true. Killil's silence was never absence. It was action. The man communicated by doing, and the absence of a message from Killil was itself a message, one that said, "I understood what was required, and I am already doing it, and I did not consider it necessary to waste time confirming what you already know I would do." Ahen moved to the table and looked at the maps. His eyes found Shandali immediately, the small mark on the parchment that represented the position Damir Khan had taken in the night, and then his eyes moved outward from that point in concentric circles, reading the terrain the way a man reads a letter from an old friend, with familiarity and understanding, and the particular kind of attention that comes from knowing the subject deeply enough to notice what has changed. He said, "Damir Khan will fortify." Turhan from behind him said, "Yes." Arhen said, "He will expect us to come to him." Turhan said, "Yes." Arhen said, "We will not." And that was the moment when the shape of the next several days was determined, not in a dramatic pronouncement, not in a speech delivered to assembled troops with banners flying and drums beating, in 3 sentences spoken quietly over a map in a room where 3 men stood in the early morning light and understood each other completely. We will not come to him, which meant they would go around him, which meant Shandali, which Damir Khan had taken at such cost and with such careful use of intelligence, would become not a stronghold but a trap, a position that consumed resources to hold while contributing nothing to the defense of anything that actually mattered. Which meant Damir Khan would eventually have to choose between staying in a position that was becoming irrelevant and leaving a position that he had paid to take, and both choices would cost him. And the beauty of the strategy, if beauty is the right word for something designed to produce suffering, was that the cost was the same regardless of which choice he made. Faladios arrived. He came through the door the way Faladios always came through doors, as though the door had been in his way, and he had chosen to tolerate it rather than remove it. He was already talking before he had fully entered the room. He said, "I spoke to 3 of my scouts an hour ago. Damir Khan has pulled his forces inside Shandali's outer wall and is reinforcing the eastern gate. He has approximately 400 men inside the fortification and another 150 positioned along the ridge to the north, which is where he expects us to approach from because it is the obvious approach, and Damir Khan is a man who thinks in terms of the obvious." Arhin said, "The ridge to the north." Falladio said, "Exactly. He has put his best archers there, 50 of them, good men, well positioned. If we came from that direction, we would take casualties before we reached engagement distance." Arhin said, "We are not coming from that direction." Falladios looked at him for a moment, and then a very slight change occurred in his expression. Not a smile. Falladios did not smile before engagements, but something in the vicinity of satisfaction, the kind of expression a man makes when he has been hopping for a particular answer and has just received it. He said, "The southern approach then." Arhin said, "No." Palladios waited. Arhin said, "We are not going to Shandali at all." Now Palladios was genuinely surprised, and genuinely surprised was a state he occupied so rarely that the expression for it seemed to sit awkwardly on his face, like clothing that belonged to someone else. He said, "Then where?" Arhin placed his finger on the map, not on Shandali, not on the ridge to the north or the southern approach, or any of the positions that Damir Khan had prepared for. His finger landed on a point to the west, a point that was not a fortress and not a city and not even a village, a point that was, on the map, nothing more than a crossroads where three paths met at the edge of a forest. Mustafa looked at the point and said, "That is the supply route." Arhan said, "Yes." Mustafa said, "Damir Khan's supply route, the route that connects Shandali to Shahanshah's main provisions." Arhan said, "Yes." Palladios looked at the map and then looked at Arhan and said, "You are going to starve him out of a position he just took." Arhan said, "I am going to let him starve himself. There is a difference. He chose to occupy a fortification that requires provisioning. He chose to place himself inside walls that need to be fed. I did not make that choice for him. I am simply going to make that choice expensive." Tarhan, from his position near the wall, said, "Damir Khan will send riders when the supplies stop coming." Arhan said, "Yes, he will send riders, and those riders will find Killil waiting for them at the place where the forest narrows and the path is only wide enough for two horses abreast, and Killil will not need to defeat them. He will only need to delay them. Every hour that Damir Khan spends waiting for supplies that do not arrive is an hour in which his men eat food they cannot replace. Every day is a calculation he did not anticipate making. And men who are forced to make calculations they did not anticipate making are men who are already losing, even if they do not yet know it." Palladios said, "What about Shahanshah? When he realizes what we are doing, he will redirect forces to protect the supply route." Arhan said, "That is exactly what I want him to do." And now the second layer of the strategy became visible, and Palladios saw it, and Mustafa saw it, and Tarhan, who had already seen it the previous night in the four-word exchange at the window, simply confirmed it by shifting his weight very slightly, the way he shifted his weight when something he already knew was being said aloud for others to hear. Because if Shahanshah redirected forces to protect the supply route to Shandali, he would be pulling those forces from somewhere else. And the somewhere else that Shahanshah would pull them from was the eastern flank of his main position, because the eastern flank was the farthest from the supply route and therefore, by the logic that governs these decisions under pressure, the most expendable. And the eastern flank of Shahanshah's main position was the approach to Iznik, which was the thing Arhan Sahib had originally demanded at the negotiation table, which was the thing Shahanshah had refused to give, and which would now be taken, not because Arhan had demanded it with words, but because the structure of events had been arranged so that the path to it opened naturally, inevitably, the way water finds its way downhill, not because anyone tells it to, but because the shape of the ground permits no other direction. This was the difference between demanding and creating. Arhan Sahib did not demand what he wanted. He created the conditions under which what he wanted became inevitable. The enemy participated in his own defeat, not through foolishness, not through incompetence, but through the perfectly rational responses to perfectly designed pressures. Palladios said, "How many men at the crossroads?" Arhin said, "Enough to hold the position against the first response. 200, under your command." Palladios received this with a nod that was entirely professional and entirely personal at the same time, because being given a command by Arhan Sahib was both a tactical assignment and a statement of trust, and Palladios, for all his bluntness, for all his rough-edged directness, understood the weight of both. He said, 200 is sufficient if the position is prepared before we arrive. I will need 4 hours to dig in properly." Arhan said, "You will have 6. We do not move until after the wedding." This was said simply, without emphasis, without the dramatic pause that a lesser commander might have placed before or after it. But the meaning was enormous. It meant that Arhan Sahib, on the morning of a day that would determine the direction of a war, on the morning when time was the most valuable resource any of them possessed, was choosing to give 6 hours of that time to a wedding. Not because weddings are more important than wars, not because love outweighs strategy in the calculations that commanders must make, but because the men who fight for you must know that the things they love are protected by the same authority that sends them to die. If a soldier believes that his commander sees him only as a tool, as a weapon to be deployed and recovered and deployed again until it breaks, that soldier will fight with his body, but not with his soul. And a soldier who fights without his soul is half a soldier, regardless of his skill. Arhan Sahib was not merely permitting the wedding. He was attending it. He was being present for it. He was saying with his presence that this moment matters, that Evronos matters, that Fatima matters, that the life they are choosing to build together matters, and that the war which surrounds that life is being fought, among other reasons, so that lives like theirs can exist. This is what it costs to lead. Not just the decisions about where to place soldiers, and when to move and how to read a map, and what your enemy will do next. All of that is the easy part, or if not easy, at least learnable, teachable, transferable from one generation to the next through instruction and practice and repetition. The hard part is this. The hard part is knowing when to stop being a commander and start being a human being, and doing both without losing either. Mustafa said, "I will inform the captains. We move after midday." Arhan said, "After midday." And Mustafa makes sure Altadin Sahib is informed personally. He will have opinions. Let him have them before we begin, not during. Mustafa almost smiled at this, because it was a precise and accurate reading of Altadin Sahib's particular way of contributing to operations, which was to have extensive, detailed, well-reasoned opinions about everything, delivered at considerable length, and which were almost always correct, but almost always better received before the action than during it. Mustafa left. Faladios remained for a moment longer. He looked at the map one more time, and then he looked at Arhan, and he said, Yakid would not have survived to see this day. It was an odd thing to say, and for a moment the room was quiet. Then Arhan said, no, he would not have. Faladios said, I do not say this to celebrate his death. I say it because the leak at Chandali, the information that Damir Khan used to time his approach and avoid the watch rotations, that information came from the same kind of crack in the same kind of wall that Yakid represented. We closed one crack and another opened. This does not end. Arhan said, no, it does not end. It continues for as long as there are men who calculate that the cost of loyalty exceeds the cost of treachery, and there will always be such men. Our task is not to eliminate them, because that is impossible. Our task is to make the calculation wrong, to make loyalty so valuable and treachery so expensive that the calculation fails for anyone who attempts it. Faladios said, and for the man who has already made the calculation and already acted. Arhan said, Mahmud is finding the answer to that question. When he has found it, we will act, and the action will be visible, and it will be remembered. Faladios nodded and left. And Arhan Sahib was alone with Tarhan in the room where the maps lay spread on the table, and the light from the window had grown strong enough to illuminate every detail, every contour line, every path and river and ridge, the entire terrain of the war laid out in ink and parchment and weighted with stones. He said, go prepare yourself. It is a wedding day. Tarhan said, I am always prepared. Arhan looked at him, and for a brief moment something moved across his face that was not command, and was not strategy, and was not the iron will that the world saw. It was something warmer, something closer to what exists between men who have stood between each other and death often enough that the ordinary language of friendship is insufficient, and the only adequate expression is continued presence. He said, I know you are. Go anyway. Put on something clean. Fatima will notice if you do not. Tarhan made a sound that was as close to a laugh as Tarhan ever came, and he left. The wedding preparations began in earnest with the first full light of morning. The palace transformed, not in the grand, theatrical way that royal courts transform for celebrations, with imported fabrics and constructed arches, and the kind of excess that announces itself from a distance. Bursa was not that kind of place, and Arhin Sahib was not that kind of ruler. The transformation was smaller and more genuine. Flowers were placed with care rather than abundance. The courtyard was cleaned until the stones shone. Lanterns were hung, though it was morning, and they would not be lit until evening, because the act of preparing for light is itself a kind of celebration. Malhoun Khartan moved through the preparations with the authority that comes from having organized many such events and caring about each one equally. She checked the food. She checked the seating. She checked the flowers and the lanterns and the arrangement of the courtyard and the readiness of the musicians and the presence of every person who was supposed to be present and the absence of every person who was supposed to be absent. Gonya followed her, asking questions, confirming details, occasionally disagreeing in the affectionate way that daughters disagree with mothers when they know the mother is right, but feel obligated to offer an alternative perspective for the sake of completeness. Nilüfer handled the guest arrangements with quiet efficiency, ensuring that the visiting families were properly received and properly seated and properly attended to, that no one felt neglected, that the small but significant hierarchies of social precedence were observed without being made so visible that they became an insult to anyone lower in the hierarchy. Asporça had emerged from her room composed and dressed, and holding herself with the specific discipline that she had now made her permanent outward presentation. The grief was still there. It would be there for a long time, possibly always, but it was no longer running loose inside her. She had given it a structure. She had told it where to live, and she moved through the wedding preparations with a kind of deliberate participation that said, "I will not let my loss diminish someone else's joy." Iraj, who had turned the woman with the child away twice the previous evening and who had slept poorly because of it, though she would not have admitted this to anyone, found herself looking toward the palace gate more than once during the morning, checking, without quite acknowledging that she was checking, whether the woman had returned. She had not yet, but the morning was young. Difner was present but peripheral, occupying the edge of things in the way she always occupied the edge of things, close enough to see everything, far enough to avoid being drawn into the center of anything. She helped where help was needed, quietly, competently, without volunteering commentary or opinion, which made her simultaneously the most useful and the most unreadable person in the palace. Evronos had been kept separate from the main preparations, as tradition required. He was in a room on the western side of the palace with two of his men, and he was doing something that his men found both characteristic and amusing, which was packing. Evronos did not pace before battles. Before battles he was still, focused, contained, a man whose energy was directed inward and downward, compressed like a spring, ready to release at the moment of contact. But before his wedding he paced, back and forth across the small room, his boots marking a path on the stone floor, his hands alternately clasped behind his back and hanging at his sides, and reaching up to adjust the collar of his wedding coat, which did not need adjusting. One of his men said, "If you wear a groove in that floor, they will charge you for the repair." Evrono stopped packing for exactly 3 seconds, looked at the man, and then resumed packing. The other man said, "He is nervous. Our great commander, who has faced cavalry charges without blinking, is nervous about standing in a courtyard and saying yes." Evrono said, "I am not nervous. I am preparing." The first man said, "For what?" Evrono said, "For the rest of my life." And that silenced them both, because it was true, and because it was said without humor, without deflection, without the protective layer of jest that men usually place over statements of genuine emotional significance. Evronos had said what he meant, and what he meant was large enough to fill the room. He looked down at the ring on his finger, the archery ring, her father's ring. The weight of it was slight, a few grams of metal, nothing compared to the weight of a sword or a shield or the armor he wore in battle. But it felt heavier than all of those things combined, because it carried something that metal is not supposed to be able to carry, which is trust and hope, and the specific kind of vulnerability that comes from allowing another person to become essential to your survival. Evronos had been a soldier for most of his life. He understood vulnerability in the military sense, the exposure created by an unguarded flank, the risk of a supply line that stretches too far, the danger of a position that can be enfiladed. He knew how to manage those vulnerabilities, how to mitigate them, how to turn them into traps for the enemy who thought to exploit them. But this vulnerability was different. This was the vulnerability of caring, of having something to lose that was not a position on a map or a supply line or a strategic advantage, but a person, a specific, irreplaceable, non-substitutable person whose absence would not merely create a tactical problem, but would fundamentally alter the meaning of everything. He had never had that before. He had had comrades, brothers in arms, men whose loss would grieve him. But this was different in kind, not just in degree, and the difference was precisely what made the packing necessary, because his body was trying to process something his mind had already accepted, but his nervous system had not yet integrated. He stopped at the window and looked out at the courtyard where the preparations were nearing completion. Workers were placing the last of the flowers. Musicians were testing their instruments in the way musicians test instruments before performances, quiet fragments of melody that do not yet connect to each other but will, when the time comes, combine into something coherent. He said, to no one in particular, to the window, to the morning, "Today I become something I have never been." And then the call to prayer sounded across Bursa. It came from the minaret of the mosque that Arhan Sahib had built in the early years of his rule, a structure that was not the tallest or the grandest in the region, but that was, by deliberate design, the most perfectly proportioned, the one whose sound carried the farthest, the one that seemed to gather the morning air into itself and transform it into something that was simultaneously a summons and a gift. The voice of the muezzin traveled across the rooftops and through the open windows and into the rooms where soldiers were sharpening swords and women were arranging flowers, and a bridegroom was packing, and a commander was standing alone with maps that would soon become irrelevant, and a woman with a child was waking in a doorway and preparing to make her third attempt at the palace gate. Allahu Akbar, God is greatest. And for a moment, every person in the city, regardless of what they were doing, regardless of what they were planning, regardless of what they feared or hoped or dreaded or anticipated, was connected by that sound. Not in the sentimental way that poets describe connection, not as a metaphor, but actually, physically, acoustically connected, their ears receiving the same waves of sound, their bodies existing inside the same sphere of vibration, their individual moments temporarily merged into a collective one. Then the call ended, and the individual moments separated again, and everyone returned to the specific business of their specific morning. Arhin Sahib prayed. He prayed the way he always prayed, with the particular quality of attention that he brought to everything, the same attention he gave to maps and to men, and to the calculation of distances and the assessment of character. He did not pray quickly. He did not pray as a formality. He prayed as a conversation, private and genuine, and conducted with the understanding that the party on the other side of the conversation does not require eloquence or performance, but does require honesty. He asked for guidance, not for victory, because victory is an outcome, and outcomes belong to the category of things that are decided by forces larger than any individual will. He asked for guidance, which is the ability to see correctly, to judge accurately, to act justly, to lead without becoming so consumed by the demands of leadership that the person inside the leader disappears. He asked for mercy, for the men who would fight today and the men who would fight against them, for the men who would die, for the men who would kill, for the specific, terrible transaction that occurs when two men face each other with blades and one of them stops existing. He asked for mercy for both sides of that transaction because both sides need it, the dead because they are dead, and the living because they have to continue living with what they have done. He asked for patience, not in the abstract sense that patience is usually invoked, but in the specific sense that applied to this day, this situation, these hours. The patience to attend a wedding when a war is waiting. the patience to celebrate joy when grief is present, the patience to hold both things simultaneously without allowing either one to consume the other. He finished praying, and he stood, and he went to the wedding. The courtyard was full, not in the overwhelming, crushing way of a grand public celebration, but in the warm, contained way of a gathering that includes exactly the people who should be included and no one else. The commanders were there, those who could be spared from their positions. The families were there. The household was there. The children of the household were there, running between the legs of adults in the way children run at celebrations, half understanding the significance of what is happening and fully participating in the energy of it. Arhan Sahib took his place at the front, and the assembly settled into quiet. The Imam began the ceremony with the words that have begun every such ceremony since the beginning of the tradition. Words about union and commitment, and the creation of a new thing from two existing things. Words that are ancient and familiar, and that become new each time they are spoken over a new couple, because the people are new even when the words are not. Fatima entered. She was dressed simply, in the way that women of this household dressed for significant occasions, without ostentation, without the kind of excess that substitutes quantity for meaning. What she wore was beautiful not because it was expensive, but because it was chosen with care and worn with grace, and illuminated by the particular quality of attention that a bride brings to her own appearance on a day when her appearance matters not for vanity, but for the marking of a threshold. Evronos watched her approach, and his packing was forgotten, and his nervousness was forgotten, and the calculations of war were forgotten, and the ring on his finger was not forgotten, but was instead activated, made present, made relevant, connected to the living, breathing, approaching reality of the woman who had given it to him. The Imam spoke. The witnesses confirmed. The contract was read. And at the moment when the question was asked, the question that reduces all the complexity of two lives to a single syllable, the question that every other question in a marriage eventually traces back to, Evronos said yes. And Fatima said yes. And the courtyard erupted in the specific kind of joy that belongs only to weddings, a joy that is not merely happiness, but is happiness combined with relief, combined with hope, combined with the particular vulnerability of witnessing something new being created, and knowing that new things are fragile and hopping, fiercely, collectively, that this one will prove durable. Malhoun embraced her daughter. Then she embraced Evronos. Then she held them both at arm's length and looked at them and said, "May God write your names together in the book of the blessed." Gonya cried. She cried openly and without apology, the way women cry at weddings when the crying is not sadness, but overflow, the body's way of processing an emotion too large for any other container. Nilüfer stood beside Gonya and handed her a cloth for her tears and said nothing, because some moments require the gift of silence. Asporça watched from a slight distance, and her expression was complicated in the way that expressions are complicated when joy and grief occupy the same space inside a person. She was happy for Fatima, genuinely, unreservedly happy. And she was also aware, with the sharp, constant awareness of the newly bereaved, that her father would not see this, would not be here for this, would not stand in a courtyard and watch someone he loved begin a new life. She held both things. She did not let either one erase the other. Arhan Sahib offered his congratulations with the specific formality that the occasion required and the specific warmth that the people deserved. He placed his hand on Evronos' shoulder and said, "You have taken on the most important command of your life. Guard it well." Evronos said, "With everything I have." And Arhan said, "Then you will be sufficient." Tarhan offered no congratulations, because Tarhan did not offer things verbally. Instead, he stood at the edge of the courtyard and watched the couple and watched the crowd and watched the perimeter, and when Evronos caught his eye across the distance, Tarhan gave the smallest possible nod, a gesture so minimal that anyone who did not know him would have missed it entirely, a gesture that contained, in its compression, everything that Tarhan would have said if he were a man who said things, which was, "I am glad for you, and I will protect what you have built." and you do not need to worry about anything outside this courtyard today. The celebration continued. Food was brought, music was played. The particular rituals that follow a wedding ceremony were observed, the exchange of gifts, the reception of guests, the formal introductions, the blessings offered by elders whose age gives their words a weight that younger voices cannot achieve. And through all of it, underneath all of it, running like a river beneath ice, the awareness that this celebration existed inside a pause, that what had been paused would resume, that the men who were laughing and eating and congratulating would soon be riding and fighting and bleeding, that the maps in the council room were waiting, that the crossroads in the forest where Palladios would position his 200 men was waiting, that Killil, wherever Killil was already waiting. The Daimir Khan inside Shandali was eating supplies that would not be replenished and did not yet know it. This awareness did not diminish the celebration. It deepened it, because joy that exists in the knowledge of its own fragility is not lesser joy. It is the truest kind. It is joy that understands what it costs to exist, what conditions are required for its survival, what threats surround it, and chooses to exist anyway. This is what these people understood. This is what living at the edge of things teaches you. Not to postpone joy until the danger is past, because the danger is never past, not fully, not permanently. But to seize joy when it presents itself and hold it with both hands and let it fill you completely for as long as it lasts, because the memory of joy held completely is the fuel that carries you through the next darkness. The celebration reached its highest point in the early afternoon, when the sun was directly overhead, and the courtyard was warm, and the music had found its rhythm, and the food had been consumed, and the formal elements of the occasion had been completed, and what remained were simply people being together, enjoying each other's company, allowing themselves the rare luxury of not being soldiers or commanders or political figures, but simply human beings in a courtyard on a beautiful day. And then Arhin Sahib stood. He did not announce his departure. He did not make a speech. He simply stood, and Tarhan materialized at his side, as though Tarhan had been standing there all along and had merely been invisible until this moment. And they walked out of the courtyard together, and the mood shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that was visible to most of the guests, but in the specific way that the mood in any room shifts when the person who anchors it leaves. Those who knew understood. The pause was ending. The celebration would continue, the music would play, the guests would talk, the bride and groom would receive their remaining blessings. But the commander was gone because the commander had somewhere to be, and the somewhere he had to be was a crossroads in a forest where the supply route to Shandali could be cut, and the geometry of a war could be rearranged. Palladios had left the courtyard 20 minutes earlier, so quietly that only 3 people noticed. He had gone to assemble his men, the 200 who would hold the crossroads, and he had done so with the specific efficiency that characterized everything he did. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words. Each instruction delivered once, clearly, with the expectation that it would be understood and executed without repetition. His men were ready within the hour. They were the kind of men who are ready within the hour because they are, in some fundamental sense, always ready, the way Tamir Boga was always ready, the way Turhan was always ready, the way readiness becomes not a state you enter, but a quality you possess. They rode out in the early afternoon, 200 men moving through the forest in a column that was tight enough to be efficient and loose enough to avoid presenting a concentrated target, and Palladios rode at the front, which was where Palladios always rode, because Palladios believed that a commander who leads from the rear is asking his men to do something he is not willing to do himself, and Palladios was not that kind of commander. The forest closed around them. The sound of their horses changed as the ground changed, from the hard, packed earth of the road to the softer soil of the forest floor, and the light changed too, filtering through the canopy in patterns that moved as the wind moved the leaves, creating a world of shifting illumination and shadow that was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you are not in a position to fully appreciate their beauty. Palladios spoke to no one during the ride. He was thinking. He was running through the position in his mind, the crossroads where the 3 paths met, the terrain around it, the angles of approach and withdrawal, the distances, always the distances, because distances were what Palladios understood better than anyone. He knew that the crossroads offered two natural advantages and one significant disadvantage. The first advantage was elevation. The crossroads sat on a slight rise, which meant that anyone holding it had the benefit of higher ground, which in close combat is worth 100 men and in archery is worth even more. The second advantage was the forest itself, which limited the width of any approaching force to the width of the paths, which meant that numerical superiority was reduced to practical irrelevance, because you cannot bring 1,000 men through a gap that only admits 10 abreast. The disadvantage was water. There was no water source at the crossroads. The nearest stream was a quarter-mile to the south, and accessing it would require sending men away from the position, which would reduce the force holding the crossroads and create a vulnerability that a competent opponent could exploit. Palladios had already solved this problem. His men carried water enough for 3 days. If they needed to hold the position longer than 3 days, they would rotate men to the stream in pairs, maintaining the defensive strength at all times. It was not elegant. It was not comfortable. But Palladios had never been interested in elegance or comfort. He was interested in effectiveness. They reached the crossroads in the late afternoon. The position was everything Palladios expected it to be, and nothing he did not expect it to be, which was the ideal outcome of advance reconnaissance done properly. He dismounted and walked the perimeter once, noting the placement of trees, the density of undergrowth, the sight lines to each of the 3 paths, the specific places where archers could be positioned to maximize their coverage and minimize their exposure. Then he began giving orders, not loudly, not with the commanding voice that stories attribute to battlefield commanders, quietly, specifically, precisely. You here, you there, dig here, clear that. Stack stones here for cover. Set a lookout at that point, and another at that point, and a third at the bend in the northern path where it curves before straightening. His men moved. They moved the way well-trained soldiers move, without hesitation, without questions, without the kind of confusion that results from unclear instruction. Each man knew his role, because each man had worked with Palladios long enough to understand the grammar of his orders, the specific language he used, the particular shorthand that years of shared service create. Within 2 hours, the crossroads was transformed from an unremarkable meeting of paths into a defensive position that would require a significant force to overcome. Not impregnable. Nothing is impregnable, but expensive. Expensive enough that any commander approaching it would have to decide whether the cost of taking it was worth the benefit, and that calculation, that moment of hesitation, that pause between recognizing the obstacle and deciding to engage it, was the real weapon. Because hesitation is the gift you give to the defender. Hesitation is time, and time is what Orhan Sahib was buying. As the sun began its descent, and the shadows in the forest lengthened, and the light took on the golden quality that it takes on in the last hours before evening, Palladios stood at the center of his position and looked at what his men had built and found it acceptable. He said to no one in particular, to the forest, to the crossroads, to the evening, let them come. Miles away in Chandali, Damir Khan was having his evening meal, and not yet aware that it was one of the last evening meals he would have in abundance. Ate well because the provisions he had brought were generous, and because he was a man who believed in eating well before battle, which he still expected to come in the form of a direct assault from the north, from the ridge where he had placed his archers, from the obvious approach that obvious men choose. He had received reports throughout the day confirming that Orhan Sahib's forces had not moved, that the palace at Bursa was engaged in some kind of celebration, that the enemy appeared to be inactive. This pleased him. Inactivity on the part of the enemy was, to Damir Khan, confirmation that his move had succeeded, that the taking of Chandali had created the shock and confusion he intended, that Orhan Sahib was struggling to formulate a response. It did not occur to him, because it was not in his nature for it to occur to him, that inactivity might be a choice rather than a failure, that stillness might be strategic rather than paralytic. that a celebration might be an expression of confidence rather than a distraction from defeat. Damir Khan was a good soldier. This was true and should not be dismissed. He was brave, he was competent, he was disciplined, and he was loyal to Shahanshah in the genuine way that some men are loyal, not from calculation, but from conviction. He believed in the cause he served. He believed in the authority he represented. He believed that the taking of Shandali was not merely a tactical achievement, but a moral one, a statement that the ground belonged to those who held it, and that holding ground is the fundamental act of sovereignty. These beliefs were not wrong. They were incomplete. And the distance between wrong and incomplete is exactly the distance between a man who can be argued with and a man who can only be defeated. And Damir Khan existed in that distance without knowing it. He finished his meal and went to inspect his positions, walking the walls of Shandali with two of his captains, checking the archers on the northern ridge, confirming the placement of the reserves, examining the eastern gate where the reinforcement had been completed, and the structure was now, in his assessment, solid enough to withstand a direct assault. He looked north, toward the ridge, toward the approach he expected Arhan to take. He did not look west, toward the crossroads. And the night came. This night was different from the previous night. The previous night had been heavy with anticipation, thick with the weight of decisions being made and conversations being held, and the dense atmosphere of minds operating at their full capacity. This night was cleaner, simpler. The decisions had been made. The conversations had been held. The men were in their positions. The plan existed not as an idea, but as a physical reality. Soldiers standing at crossroads, archers positioned on ridgelines, supply lines marked on maps that were now irrelevant because the actual terrain had replaced the representation of it. In the palace at Bursa, the celebration wound down in the way celebrations wind down, gradually in stages, like a fire that is not extinguished, but that consumes its fuel and reduces itself to embers. The music slowed. The conversations became quieter. The children fell asleep in their mothers' laps and were carried to their rooms. The guests said their farewells and received their final blessings and departed into the evening. Fatima and Evronos were left alone for the first time as husband and wife. The room they occupied was simple: a lamp, a carpet, a window that looked out at the same sky that every other window in Bursa looked out at, the same stars, the same darkness, the same vast, indifferent universe that contained their small new life and the war that surrounded it. Fatima said, "Are you still nervous?" Evronos said, "I was never nervous." Fatima smiled and said, "You were packing." Evronos said, "That was preparation." Fatima said, "Preparation for what?" He looked at her, and the answer he gave was the same answer he had given his men earlier, but it meant something different now, spoken to her, in this room, in this light. He said, "For the rest of my life." And then the lamp burned, and the night continued, and the stars did what stars do, and the world held all of its people in all of their various darknesses and various lights. The soldiers at the crossroads wrapped in their cloaks against the forest chill, the archers on the ridge watching the empty approach, the commander in his chamber with his maps, the bride and groom in their room with their beginning, the grieving woman with her father's memory, the unnamed woman in the city with her child and her mourning still ahead of her, all of them held, all of them present, all of them alive in the same moment of the same night in the same world. And in the morning, what was coming would come. The supply convoy left Shahanshah's main depot before dawn, as it always did, a routine operation conducted with the routine confidence of something that has been done successfully enough times that the possibility of failure has been edited out of the minds of the men responsible for it. 20 carts, 40 guards, provisions sufficient for Shandali's garrison for 2 weeks, grain, dried meat, arrows, replacement bowstrings, medical supplies. The ordinary, unglamorous materials that make the difference between a fortress and a tomb. The convoy commander was a man named Hasser, who was competent in the way that logistics officers are competent, which is to say thoroughly, invisibly, without the kind of dramatic flair that attracts attention or produces stories. Hasser had managed supply convoys for 11 years without a significant incident, which was both his greatest achievement and the source of his greatest vulnerability, because 11 years without incident produces a specific kind of complacency, the complacency of the expert who has forgotten that expertise is not the same thing as invulnerability. Hasser's route took him along the forest road to the west, through the rolling terrain that connected the depot to Shandali, and through the crossroads where three paths met at the edge of the dense woodland. The crossroads where Faladios and 200 men had been waiting since the previous afternoon. The convoy reached the crossroads in the thin light of early morning. Hasser was riding at the front, as he always did, because he liked to see the road ahead, liked to make his own assessment of conditions rather than relying on reports from scouts. He saw the obstacle when he was 300 yards away, a barrier of felled trees across the path, the kind of obstacle that could mean either a natural event, a storm perhaps, or a deliberate act. He slowed the conv and sent 2 scouts ahead to investigate. The scouts did not return. Hasser waited. 5 minutes. 10. The forest was quiet in the specific way that forests are quiet when something is present in them that is not supposed to be there, the absence of birdsong, the stillness of the undergrowth, the particular quality of silence that is not emptiness but attention. Hasser was not a fool. He recognized the signs. He gave the order to halt the conv and form a defensive position, and his guards moved to comply, dismounting from their horses and forming a perimeter around the carts. And then Faladios spoke. Not with his sword, not yet, with his voice. He called out from the trees, from a position that Hasser could not see because Faladios had chosen it specifically because it could not be seen, and he said, "You have 2 choices. Leave the supplies and ride home alive, or stay with the supplies and die with them." Hasser, to his credit, did not panic. He assessed his situation quickly and accurately. He had 40 guards. He could not see how many men faced him, which meant the number could be anything from 20 to 2,000, and the inability to assess the enemy's strength was itself a form of defeat, because it forced him to make decisions based on worst-case assumptions. He said, "Who speaks?" Faladios said, "The man who is giving you the choice." Hasser said, "I cannot surrender supplies that belong to my lord." Faladios said, "Then you will die defending supplies that will belong to mine in approximately 10 minutes regardless of your decision." There was a pause. Hasser looked at his men, 40 guards, loyal men, good men, men who had families, men who had not signed up to die at a crossroads for 20 carts of grain. He said, "If I surrender the supplies, you guarantee safe passage." Faladios said, "On my honor and the honor of Arhin Sahib." And Hasser, who knew the weight of that name, who knew the reputation that attached to it, who knew that an oath given in that name had never been broken in the memory of any man living, made his decision. He ordered his men to lay down their weapons. The supplies changed hands, without a single drop of blood being spilled. Faladios watched Hasser and his 40 men ride away, back the direction they had come, carrying nothing but their horses and their lives, and the knowledge that they would have to explain to Shahanshah what had happened, and that the explanation would not be well received. Then he turned to his men and said, "Redistribute the provisions. Send word to Arhan Sahib. The route is closed." And a rider went, fast and light, back through the forest toward Bursa, carrying the message that the first piece of the plan had fallen into place. At Shandali, Damir Khan did not yet know. He would not know for another 2 days, when the supplies he expected to arrive did not arrive, and the riders he sent to investigate did not return, and the slow, grinding reality of a fortress without provisions began to make itself felt in the faces of his men, in the rationing that he had to impose, in the conversations that he had to have with his captains about how long they could hold, and what holding meant when no one was coming, and no one was attacking, and the enemy had simply, patiently, precisely, made their position irrelevant by refusing to engage it. This was the nature of the war that Erhan Sahib fought, not the war of grand charges and dramatic last stands and the clash of steel against steel that makes for exciting stories. The war of patience, the war of pressure applied at exactly the right points. The war that understands the enemy's needs and denies them, not all at once, not in a single devastating stroke, but gradually, continuously, the way water wears stone, not through force but through persistence. And as the rider carried his message through the forest, and as Faladios organized the captured supplies, and as Damir Khan ate the last meal he would eat without awareness of his situation, and as the morning sun climbed higher over the hills east of Bursa, the world continued to turn, carrying all of them, every one of them, toward the next chapter of a story that none of them could see the end of, because the end was still being written, still being decided, still being shaped by the choices they were making, and the choices they had not yet made. May the road carry the rider swiftly and safely. May the supplies feed the men who need them most. May the woman with the child find her way to the help she is seeking, this morning, today, before another night falls without an answer. May the newlyweds hold their beginning with the care it deserves. May the commander find in his certainty the strength to bear its cost. May the soldiers at the crossroads remain warm enough and alert enough and human enough to remember why they are standing where they are standing. And may the story that is not yet finished find its way to the next moment, and the moment after that, and the moment after that, because stories like this one, stories about people like these, stories about nights and mornings and the impossible distance between what we fear and what we hope, these stories do not end. They continue. They always continue.
Passive and ready, Damir Khan, his archers still positioned on the embankment, still watching for threats that might yet materialize. Tamir Boga emerging from the southern ravines with a grin that suggested he was slightly disappointed not to have seen action. Faladios riding in from the east, his white Pali flag still flying from the lance of the rider beside him. And now Jakarta, standing among them, his presence a testament to the power of truth and the possibility of redemption. Altadin Saheb will have reached the regional council by now, Erhan continued. If the council acts on the documents, Kilil's operations in the south will be shut down within days. Mustafa's force in the east will have cut Al-Aliadin's supply routes, which means Kilil's caravans can no longer move freely through the mountain passes. The warehouse in Ashkara is in our hands, and the grain is being distributed to the people. He paused, but Kilil himself is still free. His main counting house is in the city of Daravan, 3 days' ride west. He is there now, surrounded by his private guard, his ledgers and his gold. If we take Daravan, if we seize his records and his assets and present them to the council as evidence, the network collapses. Without Kilil's gold, Shahanshah's remaining allies cannot be paid. Without his supply chains, they cannot be fed. Without his intelligence network, they cannot communicate. The war ends not with a battle, but with an accounting. He drew his sword and held it before him. We ride for Daravan, tonight. We ride fast, we ride hard, and we ride silent. Kilil expects an army, we will give him ghosts. We will be inside his walls before he knows we have left this valley. The column reformed, horses were watered and fed, weapons were checked and rechecked. Wounded men who could still ride were given positions in the center of the formation where they could be supported. Wounded men who could not ride were left in the care of Jakarta's medical staff, with instructions to move south to the fortress when they were able. And as the column prepared to move, a messenger arrived. He came from the south, riding a horse that was foam-flecked and wild-eyed, its flanks heaving with the effort of a gallop that had been sustained far beyond what was safe or sane. The messenger himself was barely able to speak. He slid from his saddle and stood swaying on legs that no longer seemed capable of supporting his weight, and when he opened his mouth, the words that came out were broken and breathless and carried a weight that was disproportionate to their number. Sultanim, the fortress, Mahmud Sen's word. Erhan gripped the man's shoulder to steady him. Speaker. Shahanshah, he has escaped. The words fell into the silence like stones falling into deep water. They sent ripples outward through the assembled force, ripples of surprise, of alarm, of the particular dread that comes from learning that a threat you thought was contained has become a threat that is free and moving and capable of doing damage in ways you cannot predict. Erhan's hand tightened on the messenger's shoulder. His voice when he spoke was controlled, measured. The voice of a man who has received bad news and has already begun to process it, to integrate it into his calculations, to find the response that the situation demands. Hataud. The messenger swallowed hard. Treachery Sultanum, one of the guards. He was Kilil's man. He opened the cell in the night and led Shahanshah through the tunnels beneath the fortress. By the time Mahmud discovered the escape, they were gone. Mahmud sent riders in every direction, but the trail went cold in the hills. He believes Shahanshah is heading west. West, toward Daravan, toward Kilil. Orhan released the messenger and stepped back. He stood very still for a moment, his eyes focused on something that was not in the valley or on the road or in the faces of the men who watched him. He was seeing the campaign in its entirety, seeing all of its threads and connections and implications, seeing the way each piece affected every other piece, the way each decision created consequences that rippled outward through time and space like waves from a stone thrown into water. Shahanshah free and moving west, Kilil in Daravan with his gold and his guards and his network, the two of them converging, the puppet and the puppeteer reuniting, the possibility that everything Orhan had accomplished, every battle he had won, every alliance he had forged, every truth he had revealed, could be undone by two men sitting in a counting house, spending gold to rebuild the machine that Orhan had spent his last ounce of strength to dismantle. He looked at Tarhan. Tarhan looked back, and in the darkness between them, something passed that was neither words nor gestures, but understanding, the deep, wordless understanding of two men who have fought side by side for so long that they no longer need language to communicate. "We ride faster," Tarhan said. Orhan nodded. "We ride as though the souls of the dead are watching, because they are every man, woman and child who has suffered in this war, every village that has burned, every family that has been torn apart, every prayer that has been whispered into the darkness by people who had nothing left but their faith. They are watching, and they are waiting for us to finish what we started." He mounted his horse. The column surged forward into the night, 500 riders moving through the darkness with a speed and a unity of purpose that transcended the physical limitations of tired men on tired horses. They rode not as individuals but as a single organism, a vast, muscular thing that flowed across the landscape with the inevitability of a river in flood, finding the fastest path, skirting the obstacles, pouring through the gaps in the terrain with a fluidity that was almost beautiful and entirely terrifying. Behind them, the valley of the defile fell silent, the torches guttered and went out. The darkness reclaimed the space that had briefly been a stage for the drama of human choice, and the road that had been built by Roman hands 1,000 years ago lay empty and quiet under the stars, waiting with the patient, imperturbable stillness of stone for the next travelers to pass over it. Ahead of them, somewhere in the western darkness, Shahanshah was moving, Kilil was waiting, and the final act of a war that had consumed a generation was about to begin. Orhan Sahib rode at the head of his column, his sword at his side, his faith in his heart and the faces of the dead behind his eyes. He did not know what waited in Daravan. He did not know whether he would find victory or defeat, justice or betrayal, an ending or another beginning in the long chain of beginnings and endings that constituted the life of a man who had given everything he had to a cause that demanded everything and promised nothing. But he knew one thing. He would not stop. He would not falter. He would not yield. Not while there was breath in his body and fire in his soul, and a single grain of stolen wheat that had not been returned to the hands that grew it. The darkness swallowed the column, the sound of hooves faded into the distance, and the night, vast and ancient and indifferent to the struggles of the mortals who moved through it, settled over the mountains and the valleys and the roads and the rivers and the fields where the grain had once grown and would, if justice prevailed, grow again. And somewhere in that darkness, riding hard toward a reckoning that had been years in the making, a man whispered a prayer that was not for himself but for the world. "Guide us, O Allah, not to victory, for victory belongs to you alone. Guide us to truth, guide us to justice. Guide us to the place where the wheel stops turning and the darkness gives way to light and the children who are hungry tonight will eat tomorrow. Guide us." The prayer rose into the night and was carried away by the wind, upward through the stars, into the infinite silence where all prayers go and where, if the heart is pure and the cause is just, they are heard. And the riders rode on. And the war continued. And the story, like the road beneath them, stretched forward into the darkness, unfinished, unbroken, unyielding, carrying within it the promise and the peril of everything that was still to come. It rose on either side, their rocky surfaces bare and uninhabited. The ravines along the southern range were still and quiet, their shadows deepening as the sun moved westward. It looked like nothing. It looked like an empty valley on an autumn afternoon, peaceful and unremarkable, a place where nothing had ever happened and nothing ever would. It was the most dangerous place on earth. Orhan positioned his main force at the western mouth of the defile and waited. He dismounted and walked among his men, checking weapons, adjusting formations, offering quiet words of encouragement that were not speeches or exhortations but simple, human acknowledgments of shared experience. He touched a man's shoulder and said, "I saw you on the ridge yesterday. You fought well." He looked another man in the eye and said, "Your brother would be proud." He paused beside a young soldier who was trembling, not with cold but with the anticipation of violence, and he said nothing at all. He simply stood beside him for a moment, long enough for the young man to feel that he was not alone, and then moved on. These small acts of leadership, these moments of connection that were too brief and too quiet to be recorded in any chronicle, were the mortar that held Orhan's army together. They were the reason his men fought beyond the limits of what their bodies and their training should have allowed, not because they were paid to, not because they were ordered to, but because they loved a man who treated them not as instruments of his will, but as brothers in a cause that was larger than any of them and worthy of all of them. The sun moved lower, the shadows lengthened, and from the east, carried on the still air of the valley, came the sound that Orhan had been waiting for. Marching feet, hundreds of them, the disciplined, rhythmic tromp of soldiers moving in formation, their boots striking the stone road in unison, their equipment jingling and clanking with each step. Beneath the marching feet, the deeper sound of wagons, wooden wheels grinding over stone, axles creaking under the weight of supplies and equipment, and all the material that a force of 600 required to sustain itself in the field. They were coming. Orhan mounted his horse and rode to the front of his formation. He arranged his men in 3 ranks across the road, shields locked, spears leveled, their front a wall of steel that stretched from one side of the defile mouth to the other. Behind the spearmen he placed his remaining cavalry in reserve, ready to charge through gaps if the enemy broke or to reinforce the line if it bent. And then he waited. The first elements of Jakarta's column appeared at the eastern end of the defile. Scouts riding in pairs, their eyes scanning the terrain ahead with the professional caution of men trained to identify threats before they materialized. They saw Orhan's formation immediately. They reined in their horses and stared, and even at a distance of 300 paces, Orhan could see the shock on their faces. They had not expected opposition. They had expected an empty road and an easy march. They had expected to reach the fortress, free Shahanshah, and return to garrison duty, with stories of a campaign that had required nothing more strenuous than walking. Instead, they found a wall of steel. The scouts turned and galloped back toward the main column. Orhan heard shouting, the rapid exchange of reports and orders that accompanies the discovery of an unexpected enemy. Then the shouting stopped, replaced by the sounds of a column reorganizing, units being rearranged, formations being adjusted from march order to battle order. Jakarta was doing exactly what Faladios had predicted. He was processing the unexpected. He was recalculating. And in the gap between his old plan and his new one, his mind was working furiously to impose order on a situation that had suddenly become chaotic. The gap would not last, it never did, but it did not need to last long, it only needed to last long enough. Jakarta's column entered the defile in battle formation. Infantry in the center, shields raised, spears leveled, moving at a steady pace that was neither fast enough to suggest urgency nor slow enough to suggest hesitation. Cavalry on the flanks, or what passed for flanks in a space this narrow, riders pressed against the rocky slopes, their horses picking their way over uneven ground with the reluctant obedience of animals that would have preferred to be anywhere else. And in the center of the column, surrounded by his personal guard, riding a black horse with silver appointments, was Jakarta Sahib himself. Orhan had met him 3 times, the first time at a council meeting where treaties were discussed and oaths were sworn, the second time at a feast where bread was broken and stories were told and the warmth of fellowship had filled the room like sunlight, the third time on a training ground where they had sparred with blunted weapons and Jakarta had shown himself to be a competent if unimaginative swordsman, a man who relied on technique and strength rather than creativity. Now they would meet for the 4th time, and the weapons would not be blunted. Jakarta's column advanced until it was 200 paces from Orhan's formation, then it stopped. The infantry settled into defensive positions, shields locked, spears ready. The cavalry held their ground on the flanks. The silence was immense, a physical thing, a pressure that filled the defile and pushed against the eardrums and the chest and the temples. Jakarta rode forward. He stopped 50 paces from Orhan's line and raised his voice. "Orhan Sahib, I had hoped we would not meet like this." Orhan's voice carried back to him, strong and clear and empty of anger. "And yet here we are, Jakarta, standing on a road that was built by better men than either of us, preparing to spill blood that those men would have wept to see wasted. Tell me why." Jakarta was silent for a moment. His horse shifted beneath him, sensing the tension, and he steadied it with a firm hand on the reins. "I do what I must. Shahanshah is my sovereign. He commands and I obey. That is the order of things. That is the oath I swore." "Shahanshah is a prisoner," Orhan replied. He sits in chains in a fortress that he can no longer defend, surrounded by men who no longer believe in him, waiting for a judgment that he has earned through a decade of treachery and corruption. The oath you swore was to a man. The man has fallen. The oath dies with him. Oaths do not die, Jakarta said. That is what makes them oaths. Orhan leaned forward in his saddle. Then tell me this, Jakarta. When you swore your oath to Shahanshah, did you also swear to serve Kilil? Did you swear to protect the merchant who stole grain from your own people and sold it back to them at prices that turned farmers into beggars and children into corpses? Did you swear to uphold a system that turned your soldiers into instruments of a commercial enterprise and your homeland into a marketplace where human suffering was the primary commodity? Jakarta did not respond. Because I have documents, Orhan continued, ledgers, correspondence, proof that every weapon in your armory was purchased with gold that came from the sale of grain stolen from the villages you claim to protect. Proof that Shahanshah knew, proof that he profited, proof that the war you think you are fighting is not a war at all. It is a business, Jakarta, and you are not a soldier, you are inventory. The words hit like arrows. Orhan could see them landing, see the impact in the slight flinch of Jakarta's shoulders, in the way his hands tightened on the reins, in the brief, involuntary shift of his eyes toward the men behind him, the soldiers who were hearing every word. You lie, Jakarta said, but there was no conviction in his voice. It was the denial of a man who already knows the truth and is fighting not against the evidence, but against the implications. Then come and read the documents yourself, Orhan said. Ride to my line under flag of parley. I will show you everything, every page, every entry, every signature. And if you still believe that I am lying, if you still believe that your oath to Shahanshah is worth more than the truth, then we will settle this with steel and Allah will judge between us. Jakarta was still for a long time. Behind him, his column waited in the defile, compressed and vulnerable, exactly where Orhan wanted them. Above them, hidden behind the rocks of the northern embankment, Damir Khan's archers watched through the gaps between boulders, their bows drawn, their arrows nocked, their breathing controlled and steady. To the south, in the ravines along the base of the mountains, Tamir Boga's riders sat motionless on their horses, waiting for the signal that would send them crashing into the baggage train at the rear of the column. And behind Jakarta's force, invisible to him, Faladios had sealed the eastern mouth of the defile with 50 men and a determination that was worth 500. The trap was set, the coffin was closed. All that remained was to see whether its occupant would choose to lie down in it. Jakarta made his decision. He dismounted. He handed his reins to an aide and walked forward alone, his hands empty, his armor catching the last rays of the sun that was sinking behind the western mountains. He walked with the stiff, mechanical gait of a man whose body is moving but whose mind is somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark and private, and filled with the sound of everything he believed crumbling around him. He reached Orhan's south wind carried smoke, not the clean smoke of campfires or the sharp, resinous smoke of pine burning in a hearth, but the thick, oily smoke of destruction, the kind that clings to clothing and skin and memory and does not wash away. It drifted through the mountain passes like a living thing, curling around boulders and sliding through gaps between trees, filling the lungs of men and horses with the taste of everything that had been lost in the days behind them and everything that would be risked in the hours ahead. Orhan Sahib rode at the center of his column now, not at its head. Tarhan had insisted. The passes were narrow, choked with loose stone and fallen timber, and an ambush could come from any direction, from above where the cliffs rose in vertical walls of grey and brown rock, from below where dry riverbeds cut through the terrain like open wounds, from ahead where the trail bent and twisted around blind corners that could conceal 100 men or 1,000. Tarhan wanted space. He wanted room to react, to intercept, to place his body between his commander and whatever blade or arrow or treachery the world chose to hurl at them next. So Tarhan rode ahead with a screen of 10 riders, the best horsemen in the column, men who could control their mounts on terrain that would have defeated lesser animals and lesser riders. They moved in pairs, each pair separated by 30 paces, each man watching a different sector of the landscape, their eyes moving constantly, scanning, evaluating, discarding, the ceaseless visual patrol of men who had learned that the difference between seeing a threat 1 second earlier and 1 second later was the difference between living and dying. Behind Orhan, the column stretched back through the pass in a long, uneven line that rose and fell with the terrain like a serpent navigating broken ground. 300 men, that was all he had left. Some of Tamir Boga's riders had stayed at the warehouse to guard the grain and organize its distribution. Others had been left at the ridge under Mahmud's command to hold the position and manage the prisoners. Mustafa's force was still operating in the east, cutting Al-Aliaddin's supply routes. Altadin Saheb was still in the south, presenting Kilil's documents to the regional council. 300 men against Jakarta's 600. The numbers were unfavorable. They had been unfavorable before at the fortress, at the ridge, at the warehouse. Unfavorable was becoming a permanent condition, a landscape feature as constant and unavoidable as the mountains themselves. But numbers told only part of the story. Numbers did not account for the quality of men, for the depth of their conviction, for the hardening that occurs when a force is tested again and does not break. Orhan's 300 had been forged in continuous battle. They had fought at night and marched by day and fought again without rest, without complaint, without the luxury of doubt. Each engagement had burned away something soft and unnecessary, some layer of hesitation or self-preservation, until what remained was pure function, pure purpose, a human machine designed for one thing and one thing only. And Jakarta's 600 had not been tested at all. They had spent the war in garrison duty, guarding supply depots and patrolling safe roads, growing comfortable and complacent behind walls that other men had built and other men defended. They were well-fed, well-rested, well-equipped. They had clean uniforms and sharp weapons and the arrogant confidence of soldiers who have never tasted defeat because they have never tasted battle. Orhan intended to change that. He called Faladios to his side as the column navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of trail, where the path narrowed to a single horse width between a cliff face on the left and a sheer drop on the right. The drop was perhaps 200 feet, falling away into a valley filled with mist so thick that the bottom was invisible. The horses snorted and shied, pressing themselves against the cliff face, their hooves finding purchase on the crumbling edge with an instinct for survival that their riders could only envy. Faladios rode up beside Orhan, his horse's flank nearly touching Orhan's, the two men so close they could have clasped hands without extending their arms. "Tell me about Jakarta," Orhan said. Faladios was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts with the methodical precision that characterized everything he did. "Jakarta Sahib is a man of systems," he said. "He builds his campaigns the way an architect builds a house. Foundation first, then walls, then roof. He does not improvise. He does not adapt well to the unexpected. His strength is in preparation and logistics. He will have planned his route of march to the hour. He will have calculated his supply consumption to the sack of grain. He will have assigned every man to a specific position and every unit to a specific task." "And his weakness?" Orhan asked. "He cannot think sideways. He can think forward and backward. He can plan for contingencies that he has anticipated. But when something happens that is not in his plan, something that comes from a direction he did not expect, he freezes. Not forever, he recovers, but there is a gap, a window, a moment when his mind is recalculating and his body has stopped receiving instructions. In that moment, he is vulnerable." "How long is the window?" Faladios considered. "Long enough." Orhan nodded. "Then we will give him something he has not planned for." They emerged from the pass in the late afternoon, the trail widening as it descended into a broad, flat valley that stretched east to west between two ranges of mountains. The valley floor was covered with grass. The line. The spearman parted to let him through, and he walked into the space behind the formation where Orhan stood beside his horse with the leather case in his hands. Orhan opened the case and handed him the first document. Jakarta read it, his face changed. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the small incremental ways that faces change when the person behind them is absorbing information that rearranges everything they know about the world. The tightening around the eyes, the slight compression of the lips, the almost imperceptible tremor in the hands that held the parchment. He read the second document, and the third, and the fourth. He read for 10 minutes while the sun set and the valley filled with shadow and the silence in the defile grew so deep and so heavy that it seemed to have physical weight. When he finished, he folded the last document carefully and placed it back in the case. He stood very still, looking at the ground between his feet, and Orhan saw something happen to him that he had never expected to see in a man of Jakarta's rigidity and self-control. He broke. Not visibly, not dramatically. There were no tears, no cries, no theatrical gestures of despair. The breaking was internal, structural, the collapse of a framework that had supported everything Jakarta believed about himself and his place in the world. The oath he had sworn, the cause he had served, the man he had followed, all of it revealed to be hollow, built not on honor or loyalty or faith, but on the calculations of a merchant who had never held a sword and never would. When Jakarta looked up, his eyes were different. The arrogance was gone. The certainty was gone. What remained was something raw and unfinished, something that looked like the beginning of a man rather than the end of one. "What would you have me do?" he asked. Orhan met his eyes. "Go back to your men, tell them what you have read, show them the documents if they wish to see them, give them the choice that I am giving you. Join us or go home. There is no dishonor in going home. There is no shame in admitting that the cause you fought for was built on a lie. The shame is in knowing the truth and choosing the lie anyway." Jakarta stood for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back through Orhan's line, through the gap